Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to the Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs. Great to see so many faces and people interested in, I guess, public affairs that are happening in this province. A little surprised this morning when I opened up the newspaper and read that I was going to be speaking about future tax increases in Lethbridge. We just sent out our tax bills last Friday, and you probably got them, and that's the last thing I want to talk about today is future tax increases. In fact, when I go through this and talk about some of the exemptions that are provided for large industrial properties and other groups, if this was corrected, I'm sure all of our taxes would go down. We'd have more people sharing the tax burden. So I want to start off, first of all, with what's considered principles for an effective property tax system. So the purpose of the system is to provide a fair and equitable distribution of the tax burden. Everybody pays their fair share. A system should be transparent and it should be easy to understand. It should be cost efficient and administratively efficient to administer or to put in place. It should provide a stable and uniform and predictable tax from one year to the next. Nobody likes their taxes going up 50% one year and down the next year. There needs to be some predictability to it. Also, there should be a separation of tax policy from the assessment process. So if you're going to provide some tax incentive or tax exemption, it shouldn't be hidden away in the assessment process. And any exemptions that you apply should be measurable. So if government wants to promote development of heavy industry, and they provide an exemption, that should be measurable, and at the end of the day, they should be able to tell whether their policy was successful or not successful. So where does your property tax go? Well, it's shared primarily with two groups and then a third group. Municipalities take probably the majority of it. It changes from municipality to municipality. And a lot of your taxes go towards, or about 25% in Lethbridge go towards provincial education, and about 1% in Lethbridge go towards the administration of senior management bodies created by the province. So this is a timely subject at this moment because the province is currently reviewing the Municipal Government Act, and they're reviewing all of the assessment and tax rules. So there's been a large consultation process on the go for the last couple of years. There's been much stakeholder input. Industry has sent in many, many papers. Obviously, they believe they're overtaxed. Professionals, such as myself, have sent in our opinions, and I sit on the Alberta Assessors Association Ledge Policy Committee, and as a group, we've sent in our positions. Municipalities have also sent in their positions about how to get a fairer and more equitable distribution of the tax burden. So, how do we get to where we are today? Well, back in 1996, there was a new act passed, the Municipal Government Act, and it moved assessments from a regulated cost approach for all properties to a market value approach. So most of the properties in the city of Lethbridge, your residential, your commercial, your industrial, are done on a market value approach. However, there's a whole group of properties that are still on the regulated approach. When the province made their change in 1996, they were undergoing considerable changes. They wanted to get out of the assessment business, and in many people's view, the job only got half finished. The regulated properties in the province were left under an old system. So, market value assessments. They're used for the vast majority of properties, as I explained. There are three approaches to value: direct sales comparison. So if you've got a lot of sales in residential property, we look at the sale prices, and that's how we do our residential property. Commercial properties, where the properties are rented or leased, we take the income, we capitalize the income, and we come up with a value. And for those unusual properties, we use a cost approach to value. Pretty simple to understand. Most people understand what the value of their property is and can compare to other people's properties. Valuations are done annually, so they're always up to date. And this system is internationally recognized. And I'd like to say in Alberta that we have the Cadillac of systems for market value properties. Now on to the second phase. Well, we've got a series of what's called regulated property assessments. What are they? Well, they're linear property, the electric power, generation, and distribution. Those are like your power lines you see over the street, your telecommunications, such as your Shaw cable, and then there's another group for carriers that are governed by the CRTC. There's pipelines, there's wells, there's gas distribution, and there's street lighting. That's the linear property sector. There's also another group or a different assessment process for railways. And then there's another category of property called machinery and equipment. And the last regulated property is kind of a motherhood one, farmland. So when we look at linear property, and keeping in mind the principles that I brought up about it being easy to understand and transparent, I just put up a definition here of a brief summary of the definition of linear property. So you can see it includes such things as transmission and distribution lines, well pipe, those things, but it doesn't include other items that might be above ground, regulating stations, or the land and improvements that are included on the with the linear property. So a quick chart. Regulated rates are established by the province. They can go in different directions, as you see cable and pipelines on the right, or on the left, and power distribution on the right. And there's different rules for each one of these groups. And in the next slide, you can see that the market value properties are on your left-hand side. They're done by direct sales, cost, income. There's a whole series of steps, as you can see on the right-hand side, for regulated property. If you're not confused by now, seek counseling. So, two of the groups there's linear property and machinery and equipment. And you can have pieces of equipment or property that look identical, and yet they have quite different means of assessment and taxation. And it's based on what they're used for, who owns them, and where they are. I'm not sure those are solid criteria for valuation, but. So we have an example here, and we have, you can see the blue boxes there and the equipment, very similar equipment. The one on the left is linear property, and it's included in the pipeline assessment, and it has zero assessment. The one on the right is machinery and equipment. You would not know the difference, but it has an assessment and it has a tax. So when we look at this a little more closely, if you follow the linear property guideline, if you have a complaint about your assessment, it's filed with the Municipal Government Board. If you have a complaint about your machinery and equipment, and these could be side by side on the same parcel of property, you have to go to the local, or the Composite Assessment Review Board, which is run by the local municipality. So, in addition, when we look at the valuation standards, both of them use regulated rates. And what that means is the government provides cost manuals, and they're assessed using the same rates. Different manuals for each side, could be the same equipment, could have different rates on it. Now we move to the valuation standard. So the level of assessment for linear property is 100% of its value. However, machine equipment is only assessed at 77% of its value. So, after the initial assessment's done on the cost, depreciation is applied. So, for linear property, you can see there's various depreciation rates depending on the type of linear property. On the other side, you can have exactly the same equipment, and machinery equipment receives a fixed and immediate 25% depreciation. So remember, we're at the 77% level and now 25%. So you've got a brand new piece of equipment that's worth $100,000, and it's now assessed at about $57,000. Brand new. Then we go on. There's different schedule for applying additional depreciation. And depending on which linear property it is, that changes by category. The M&E is not table-driven and must be proved by evidence that there's additional depreciation. So who prepares these assessments? Well, we're just at the same property, and the linear property is done by an assessor designated by the minister. Somebody from the province comes out and has a look at it. And if it's machinery and equipment, the assessor for the appointed municipality, the appointed assessor, comes out and looks at the machinery and equipment, picks it up. So in some cases, you can imagine, we have the same property assessed twice. In other areas, we have same property not assessed at all. So we move on to the assessment classification, which is the taxation rate. Linear property is classed as non-residential. Machinery and equipment has a class of its own. So based on that classification, the tax liability is for linear property, it's subject to both municipal and education taxes. There is an exemption for electric power generation, and I'll get into that a little later. The machinery and equipment is subject to municipal taxes at the non-residential rate. Back in the Klein era, towards the end of the last millennium, it was decided that machinery and equipment, they were going to reduce the tax rate from the same as non-residential to zero. So machinery and equipment no longer pays any education tax in this province. So we also have different assessed people. On the linear property, the assessment notice is sent to the operator of the linear property. That's not always easy to find who is operating the linear property. And the province relies on self-reporting. So if it doesn't get reported, well, it doesn't get assessed. Machine equipment is assessed and taxed to the owner of the machine equipment, sent out by the municipality, and the assessment notice is sent out by the municipality, and usually it's a little easier to collect off of the property owner. There are mechanisms and means that you can do the collection. So some of the differences between machinery and equipment that I've outlined is who's assessed. Who really, is it the operator or is it the owner? Is the property machinery equipment or is it linear? There's obviously increased confusion, and there's two levels of government involved, the province for linear and the local assessor for the machinery and equipment. So some examples here is you'll notice there's two towers here that look relatively similar. Tower on the left is linear assessment at $210,000. The building, the fence, the land is assessed as non-residential by the local assessor. The linear assessment is completed by the provincial assessor. Tower on the right is non-residential at $85,000. You notice the difference in the rates and the assessment. And the equipment is machinery equipment, so it's at $90,000. And of course, that machinery equipment is exempt from school taxation. Both are telecommunication towers. They serve the same purpose. The only difference here is the ownership. One is owned by a company that's governed by the CRTC, and the other one's not. We have another picture here of some linear property, and once again, these are somewhat similar equipment that are used to run. One of them, the one on the left, is actually integrated into the linear property, and so it has a zero assessment. The one on the right is considered machinery and equipment and is assessed at $25,000. Sorry, on the wrong slide, but same discussion. different values. All right, so there's some problems with the current system as it deals with linear property and machinery and equipment. So moving on, as I said, one of the key principles, again, is clarity and easy to understand. We look at the definition of machinery and equipment. It means materials, devices, fittings that forms an intricate part of the operational unit, used or intended to be used for the following purposes. Lot of room for interpretation there of what it is we're actually looking at and what, if it's accessible or not. So the first question, is it used in manufacturing and processing? Is that occurring in the place it's at? The second thing is, in the process, is there a change in nature? A recent decision in Alberta is that they found by mixing the different types of gas to get a higher octane, resulted in this being considered machinery equipment. So a whack of property owned by the oil company was moved from the one category to the other. It no longer pays school tax and has a lower rate of assessment. And some of the other things are all of the components integral to the operational unit. So you could have two craneways in the same business or in the same property. One could be used as part of the manufacturing and processing. The other could be just moved to there to move stuff around. One is assessed using machinery equipment rates. The other one is assessed using regular building and structure rates. And the result will be quite different. When we look at the valuation standard for machinery equipment, I mentioned this before, most of our properties are at 100% market value. The machinery equipment is at 77% of value. The last time the rates were updated, I believe, was 2006. So we've seen a few changes since then. And not only the rates outdated, but some of the technologies that are in place today are not even included in the rates and oftentimes are left unassessed. And these properties get a 25% fixed and immediate depreciation, as I mentioned previously. So some issues with M&E. The rates are outdated. There's no rate for new technologies. Definitions are outdated. 77% level and 25% fixed and immediate. Another interesting thing that we came across in our committees is that we have drag lines and these huge trucks. You'd never see them on the highway, but they're a size of 3 or 4 houses, and they're used exclusively for extraction of oil or coal. Now, in the oil sands, this equipment is considered exempt from assessment and taxation. However, the same equipment, if you drive west on Highway 16 out about by Wabamun there where they have the coal fields, you'll see the same equipment, and it's assessable and taxed. So there's a real unfairness in that current setup. So quickly on to railways. Railways, there's vast exemptions for bridge construction and for other construction costs. The railway land itself is assessed at farmland values. So you might have, if any of you been to Calgary and south of the Palisades Hotel there, they've got all of the tracks and the station grounds running through the center of Calgary. Well, they're assessed at next to nothing, absolutely next to nothing. In addition to that, there's a 60% economic depreciation factor applied to all of the rail lines and all that stuff that goes into building the roadway. An example of this, once again, we're back on the towers. Now we have 2 towers here. One of them is owned by CN Rail and is used in connection with the railway operations. So it falls under the definition of railway, and therefore there's no assessment or tax on that. If there was assessable, it would be assessed at about $730,000 and probably a tax of about $14,000 on it. The buildings and the land are assessed in this particular picture. Okay, so what's happening with farmland assessments? if you have a farm that's inside an urban municipality, the land is assessed the same as if it's in the county. It's at regulated rates. And I'll get into that a little later. If you have a farm residence on there and you're in the city, you pay based on 100% of your market value, the same as all other residences in the city. However, if you're out in the rural area, on your first residence, you get a $61,540 assessment exemption. So you don't pay any tax on that first $61,000. And if you have a second or third or fourth residence, you get up to a $30,000 exemption on those. So then we go to the farm buildings, and if you have a farm building, you're in the city, it's 50% taxable, 50% exempt. If you're in the rural area, it's not even assessable, not even on the books. So if you think about some of the intensified farming that you see across this province, and the infrastructure that needs to go into those type of facilities, all of their buildings are exempt from taxation. So there's a little poultry farm on the west side of Edmonton as you go to Highway 16. It's a multi-million-dollar business. I won't give you the name of it, but they sell poultry across Western Canada, and their property assessment per year is around $45. So, in addition to that, there's under the definitions of farming, currently there's no income criteria. So if you've got some land out there and you want to take a half a dozen horses and let them run around, you too could be a farmer and see your taxes drastically reduced. I mentioned the intensified buildings. That's a common complaint by rural municipalities now, and is that they're providing services to these intensified farms and they're not paying their fair share. All of their farm buildings are exempt. Their use of the rural services is greater than the, let's say, a grain farmer, and so there's a real unfairness. Now, the farmland rate of assessment is $400 an acre. I don't think, I can't remember the last time you could buy farmland for $400 an acre. So what we're seeing in the rural municipalities is so that the rural residents don't get hit too drastically, is the tax rates on farm property is about 5 times what the rural assessment is. So we have an example here of 2 buildings that look pretty similar. The one on the left is used as a farm building. It's exempt from assessment. It pays nothing. The one on the right is a non-farm building, and it's assessed at $155,000 there, and it would pay taxes. Okay. Some other exemptions. This is a fairly minor one, but we have all this forestry going on in this province, and we have large companies coming in and harvesting our trees and whatnot. All that timberland is exempt from assessment, and they pay no tax, no property tax on those properties. So, when they brought market value into place, market value was supposed to be used to assess all major industrial plants. But they are somewhat difficult to assess, and so the province came along and they passed this construction cost reporting guide. So, before construction costs, or construction starts, this is a very, very technical issue and a very, very complex and difficult process they put in place. So before things start, a request must be sent out to the property owner, and they've got to describe in detail what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. So you can imagine for a CNRL plant up in Fort McMurray worth $12 billion, and you want to know the size of all the pipes and all of the equipment that goes in there and whatnot, how lengthy these reports can be. And it's self-reporting. So they're lengthy and they're very complex, and they require significant time and skill to analyze. So oftentimes the assessor is forced to engage an engineer, and quite often a lawyer becomes involved. I mentioned the CNRL plant in Fort McMurray, $12 billion. It went on the roll after self-reporting for $1.5 billion. The local assessor in the area, and this is back in 2010, didn't like the reported cost. He raised it to 2.5 on $12 billion. That's been in court since. The legal cost to the municipality of Wood Buffalo has exceeded $1.2 million. When I put lawyers down there, you really do need lawyers to guide you through this stuff. So part of the excluded cost on CCRG is the preparation cost. So if you're going to build a house, you get an architect, he designs the house, that's all part of your cost. At the end of the day, you hope to recover that when you sell your property. Excluded for large plants. Your labor costs, any overtime is excluded from the cost. And labor costs are generated or usually reduced down to what it would cost if you were in the middle of Edmonton getting the construction done. So let's say you've got an existing plant and you have to shut down for 3 months while you add on to it. Those shutdown costs, your loss of production over that time period, are deducted from the assessment forever. You have your house at home, you put your driveway in, you put your trees, your fencing, all that stuff. On these large plants, your fencing, your roadway costs, your site preparation are all excluded from assessment and taxation. And not only that, you get the companies get to report as they see fit, and oftentimes there's quite a bit of a dispute over what's reported and what's actually there. So in summary on the large plants here, inadequate and inaccurate costs can lead to very, very poor assessments. The assessment departments are inadequately staffed to really spend the time that's needed on these, and the appeal process is long, causing instability in the assessment and tax base. And I refer you back to the principles that I put up at the front. These all fly in the face of those principles. So a couple other quick things. Nice picture here of a golf course. It's located on a dam reservoir area, so it's exempt from assessment and taxation. There's one located in Calgary on the Bull Reservation, or Reservation Reserve, and it's exempt from taxation. The tailing ponds that are up in Fort McMurray, they're all considered dams and waterways. They're exempt from taxation. Your electrical, we've deregulated in the province and we sell electricity to the United States. Those dams that produce the electricity that we sell are exempt from assessment and taxation. So one of the key principles about exemptions is that all property should be assessed so that the cost of the tax exemption can be measured, and so you can ascertain at the end whether the purpose of this exemption or this incentive is reaching its desired goals and outcomes. Am I running out of time? Okay. So very quickly, I'm just going to skip on and give you a quick conclusion on this. As I said, the Municipal Government Act is currently under review, and I would encourage anybody that has an interest in these issues to put in your submissions or your information to the province.